1970s, but
except for Occupy.
Yeah, and I think, I think also Occupy is a very interesting part of this conversation too. I think I haven't seen the Whitney Biennial yet, which opens tomorrow, I guess, or Wednesday now because of the snow. But they've invited Occupy museums, which came out of the Occupy group and the Occupy movement, if that's the right word, to have a role and a part of whatever the narrative is part of this year's Whitney Biennial. But I do think, the space of the street is an incredibly interesting platform, and it's up to individuals, creative people, collectives to work out how to animate and amplify that space. I don't really follow the idea that political art is somehow a secondary form. I think it's slightly more, for me at least, it's slightly more complicated than that because, I think there's a lot of art that is about politics, or there is a lot of art that has political content, but there's relatively little art that we could genuinely describe as political, i.e. work that actually creates social change or impacts on policy or actually changes the political direction of a community or a country. So I think there's a difference between art that reflects upon politics or political life and art that is genuinely political. And I think that latter category is actually quite a small territory or a small genre, if that's the right or wrong word in itself. But I do think, the current administration provides, an interesting threshold for people to work against or around. And I think we're only beginning to see some of the kind of interesting results of that, not just in culture, of course, but in political and social life as well.
I would also say from a foundation perspective, I think Matthew's distinction in terms of art that is sort of political and art that is what in some places is called socially engaged work. And I know funders like Blade of Grass, Surdna Foundation, Rauschenberg have all over the last 5 years, I would say, sort of deepened an engagement. And what I would say is foundations historically are really behind the there's no other way to say it. And trailing after artists. Up in terms of what artists see as relevant and think about that.
And I think Katie touched upon this earlier, that I think another way to think about an opportunity is, and most everybody on this panel feels this way or acts this way, and that you just can't limit artists to certain categories. You can't say you're just a painter, you just live in the city, which we do with Artadia, but if you don't define an artist by a certain thing that allows there to be room for all sorts of different practices, and I think everybody does that here. I think the conversation of how you enter that into the commercial realm, again, I think we can start with the artist-run spaces and show that kind of support, but there, at the end of the day, there needs to be objects that are, bought and sold. And so that's the hard thing that I think we'll see in terms of the transition. When you're at an art fair, maybe it isn't the place for a political conversation, but I think it's going to be inevitable. And I also agree with Matthew. I don't feel like it's a second tier conversation.
Yeah. We see that For Freedoms, the super PAC, had a huge, they have been in every sort of commercial space in a certain way. They collaborated with us on our Basel dinner. They had a big activation at Chicago Expo where red and blue, balloons fell from the sky, and a huge show at Jack Shaman across both spaces.
Or an artist like the Astor Gates, who, social practice is arguably maybe more interesting than the objects that he creates, in the sense of what he's done to impact an entire city and the entire way how artists act and are respected and what their roles are.
There's an interesting New York Times article about the museums responding to the current climate, and I bring it up just because it talked about the New York Historical Society, which is actually collecting a lot of the kind of protest items, whether it's the pink hats for Women's March or protest signs or the Post-its that were at 14th Street. But I think you're also asking this question about, is there an opportunity? And I don't know that there's an opportunity to kind of capitalize financially on what's happening, but I think that the opportunity is really around all of us to take greater risks and to get out of our comfort zones. and to think about how to support artists in new ways. And so I guess that's, for me, the kind of challenge and the inspiration that I am trying to find through this current political climate. And also, in many ways, forming more partnerships and alliances with other organizations, because I do think that we tend to be very siloed in our work to a certain extent. And now is the opportunity for us to kind of build more relationships with our fellow, directors, as well as the artists that are out there, and us being more open to figuring out how to support the work that you guys are doing, whether it's through a space like Rachel's looking for, or through having conversations as to what it means to be a politically engaged artist.
I think a powerful example of political cultural work in the United States within relatively recent memory, and of course it's an ongoing project, is the work of ACT UP around the AIDS crisis. And I think a number of artists were involved in the early days of the formation of ACT UP, and I think they used visual culture in extraordinarily powerful, interesting, innovative, and ultimately productive ways that really helped make significant goals and achievements at the late 80s period, and obviously continues to this day. And you think about the AIDS Quilt Project, which wasn't about the gallery, but it was about a form of creativity, which is labor, which was this kind of sort of folk labor of the making of these memorial banners. But accumulatively, it was an extraordinarily powerful narrative about how cultural forms and making can have a substantive impact socially, politically, and culturally. And, a legacy that obviously persists to this day.
With that, I think that I'd love to thank all of you for being here. It was really great to have this conversation with you, and also to everyone in the room, thank you for taking the time, especially in advance of the snow. So there should still be some more wine if you want to take some to go, or have a conversation with some of your colleagues in the room.
Everybody's going to be bunkered down at home.
Exactly. Thank you for being here.